Good evening, one and all present here. Today at Global Order, we have Yeshi Dawa, we have Kai Muller with us regarding certain recent developments of Tibet and the world. To begin with, there has been particular restiveness in the old province of Kham. China has been trying its best to suppress and has been redeploying troops there. It has been accusing India of trying to instigate trouble, and many Tibetans, known and unknown, are either being killed or detained. To kick off a conversation regarding what it is like in Tibet as of now, and then move on to how the world is reacting to it, I'd like Yeshi to start. What is going on in Tibet? What is China so scared of? And what are they doing about it?
First of all, I would like to thank Global Order Live for giving me this wonderful opportunity. I often say that whatever platform I get, it is also for Tibet. So if I talk a little bit about what is happening in Tibet, as you all know that 62nd Tibetan National Uprising Day happened on 10th March this year. So prior to commemorating 62nd National Uprising Day, Chinese government deployed more troops in Tibet in order to preempt some possible uprisings in Tibet. So when it comes to Kham region, it was earlier about Amdo region, because there were so many Tibetans who self-immolated in that region. So that area became very much restrictive. Now it is coming back to Kham area. As you know that there was a singer whose name is Lunduk Thapa, who sang a song called Black Hat, which is criticizing the Chinese government, and he was sentenced to prison. So that clearly shows that there isn't a space to protest in a peaceful way in Tibet. And when it comes to Kham, as we all know that I think the restrictive area does not belong only to Kham in Tibet, because that is everywhere in Tibet. Even if you look at any region in Tibet, Tibetans are living under fear. Why? Because Chinese government knows that if there is a space for any form of protest, and that will become huge, like 2008. So that's why, keeping this view in their mind, they are trying their level best to suppress any form of protest. So as far as Kham region is concerned, as we know historically, the Tibetans in Kham region were very much aggressive, right. And so that's why I think the Chinese government is trying to dominate as much as they can.
It's interesting because just a while back we were discussing, Ishan and Kai sir, that Kham has traditionally been a center of resistance against the Chinese, and even in India, most of our brave troops who belong to the Special Frontier Force, people of Tibetan origin or Tibetan nationals, they're Khampa. So they have a history of standing up to Chinese oppression. Is China scared of that history being consistently played out?
I think China doesn't have to scare Khampas in terms of population, in terms of equipment. But when we look at international fora, if you see any type of aggressive nature in Tibet, then international community comes to I should say they look at what is happening in Tibet, and that highlights the situation of Tibet. So that's why China doesn't want any type of international community's attention towards them. So that's why they're trying their level best to suppress at the earliest time. So I think that is the only reason that China is trying to suppress them.
Professor Muller, your organization, the International Campaign for Tibet, has been holding a spotlight on these developments in Kham and in other places very recently. The most recent that I read about, of course, was the detention of a religious scholar. Deekhit did mention about the murder and abduction and what appears to be murder of a tour guide who was also politically active. What can you tell us about this most recent bout of unrest and, of course, Chinese insecurity?
Well, thank you very much for having me today here. I think it's a very important discussion we're having because a lot of developments in Tibet are very interesting and I think also informative for what is going on in PRC on a larger level, perhaps. So it depends on how far we want to go back in time. For me, I think one really marker in time in recent times were the 2008 protests all over Tibet, which were followed by a very severe crackdown, a violent crackdown by the Chinese authorities. And until this day, we do not know how many people have suffered and also passed away and died in the course of this violent crackdown. So, but on a more larger, more I think a policy level, I think there has been a change taking place among Chinese authorities and policymakers vis-a-vis Tibet and how Tibet is being perceived right now. And I think that change is really closely connected to those 2008 protests, which really caught the Chinese leadership on cold footing, I should say. What ensued from our perspective is a more proactive approach of the Chinese authorities vis-a-vis the Tibetan society. This was played out in a more intrusive surveillance and control network, applying methodology, which we now see on a perhaps on an even more technologically sophisticated level in Xinjiang. But we can tie such developments to the then party secretary in the Tibet Autonomous Region, who applied these policies, Chen Quanguo, who is now party secretary in Xinjiang, as you know. So while the situation in Xinjiang is quite fundamentally different, it is somewhat also at the same time comparable because of these connections that do exist, but it is not really the same. So there's a more proactive approach, which means that there's been a grid management, surveillance management rolled out in the urban areas. There has been more severe control of Tibetan monasteries, which have been traditionally a source of resilience, of Tibetan resilience, also of Tibetan culture and cultural tradition. Then there was a program introduced that in the course of which 10,000 of party cadres were sent to the countryside in order to, as the Chinese authorities put it, to make friends with the Tibetan population and to inform the population, as they put it, about the party policies, which was nothing less from our perspective than an attempt to intrude and to apply more surveillance and control on the Tibetan population. So there was I think, if one can put it on move it to a human level, perhaps a tremendous loss of trust and confidence in their own policies and in the Tibetans per se. Now it is no longer predominantly a reactive repression and going after those who speak out in their communities, but now as it is somewhat a preventative approach that goes after Tibetans even before they are actually allegedly or not committing acts of resistance or resilience or dissent. So this, of course, puts much more pressure on the everyday life of Tibetans. It's coupled to a project, one should say, of thought transformation. That means that Tibetan religion is to be Sinicized, is to become a part of a so-called grand Chinese culture, where language is being shaped according to the needs of the Chinese societies, to the effect that Tibetan is being largely removed from classes in Tibetan schools as a medium of instruction, which of course is very concerning. And moreover, there are attempts, as you know, to interfere with some core tenets of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the appointment of Tibetan Buddhist leaders, which in effect is intended to, which is quite clear, intended to have a say and have the say vis-a-vis the next Dalai Lama. So all of these policies, they are more assertive, they are more proactive, and they are more intrusive. We call it elements of, in fact, totalitarian rule. And of course, this lays a heavy burden on any individual who is dissenting and on the Tibetan culture and society altogether. We once in a while get information about those who actually are dissenting or are removing themselves from Chinese control without even dissenting, like a scholar, for example, like somebody who is offering community support, social work, and so forth. All of these people who are out of the control of the CCP are potentially dangerous in the eyes of the CCP and need to be sort of sanctioned. And that's what we see every once in a while. It is, in fact, not just politically sophisticated, but in certain cases, it's also connected to utter brutality. If we look at those reports about, for example, deaths in custody, deaths after custody, apparently after torture has been inflicted on those individuals. So it is actually a very concerning development we've been observing for the past 10, 12 or more, a little bit more years. And it is something that needs to be on the agenda of the international community more often, more vigilantly, and that's what we are appealing to do to the international community.
Professor Muller, there's two quick things I would like to talk to you about. One is, of course, as Yeshi pointed out in the last interview, so the current Sikyong of the Tibetan people, which is Sri Lobsang Sangha, he had said that what is happening to Tibet today can happen to the world tomorrow. Now, there's something very interesting about that, which is the use of technology and repression when it comes to Tibet. Tibet and Tibetan cities are becoming the most densest places on the planet when it comes to technologies of surveillance, technologies of repression, and seeing how people are communicating and doing. And the troublesome part is China has been actively exporting that technology to other countries with similar people in charge regarding their views on political control. And secondly, many commentators in the strategic space think that there is a fundamental break between pre-Xi Jinping China and post-Xi Jinping China when it comes to intensity of how it's going about. Xi Jinping seems to have a very clear idea of how not only the traditional use of the gun can be combined with, say, technology and other softer aspects such as altering religion in, say, in the Sinicization project of Tibet. What is your comments on how things are going about there, and what are the fears for the global community?
I think it has not been fully understood yet how much has changed under Xi Jinping. Particularly because Xi Jinping has a very strategic look at all the instruments that are available And I think all instruments that are not yet available and which he wants to make use of as a potential, for example, the technology that has been developed very quickly, in tremendous steps over the past years. So I think he is very much aware of those opportunities, and I think there is not yet fully. It's not yet fully understood that he has not just the hardware, but he also wants to apply certain software, if you will, to these instruments. And it's been I think a couple of years ago. I think rather early in his tenure, he already stated that and called upon party cadres to make an extra effort to tell China's story well, to offer narratives, and that's what we've been observing on the international stage. Certain narratives that the Chinese government has been planting, if you will, in the international arena. For example, vis-a-vis development, poverty alleviation, cultural relativism, and so forth. So that is something of concern, and we see it permeating the international sphere. If you look at UN bodies, discussions, the discourse there, it is quite obvious that it's not just the hardware, but it's also the software.
The next thing I wanted to know is actually for both of you, but I want to start with Yeshi. A while back, a couple of Chinese agents were arrested in Delhi, and they were spying on the Tibetan community here. Similarly, across Europe, Australia, the United States, there's increased presence of Chinese agents directly or indirectly. They usually guard themselves in the form of businessmen or people who are involved in cultural activities. And they're being increasingly used as a tool for subversion. So, Yeshila, you've been actively involved in the advocacy for Tibet, and you live in India, you are a Tibetan. What is your experience like here, and has the threat grown when it comes to Chinese presence across the world, but in India in particular?
Even if you go to Tibet, I think one of my friends who visited Tibet, I think a few years back, he told me that if you talk to any Tibetan in Tibet about politics, you may end up in prison. And he summed up that 1 out of 10 people that you meet in Tibet is spy. So imagine, so that is the situation of Tibetans in Tibet. Now coming into exile, as you pointed out that there were many Chinese spies who are working for the Chinese government, and they're trying to extract some useful information from our government in exile. So this is how Chinese government works, because there are many Tibetan spies as well in our community. I think when our government in exile, he was basically trying to get a hair from His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. Just imagine. So we don't know why Chinese government needs a hair from His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. So Charlie, I think if I'm pronouncing his name correct, his name is Charlie, right?
Yes.
Who was caught in Delhi. So he was he was trying to be a businessman,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, he had money so that he can use any people he want in India, right? So but it was very unfortunate for him, because Indian I think I should say Indian intelligence unit caught him, right? Now so he's under investigation. We don't know what is his ultimate aim, but in terms of spy and Chinese intelligence Chinese people who are trying to intrude into Tibetan community is very clear. You can see it from news, and we don't know even we are very doubtful about our own community if we look at our community, there are many Tibetans who are trying to disunite, our community. So this is the major concern that we are trying to, raise. Even when our election is coming near, there are many people on Facebook who are trying to, disunite our, community with, various comments on, social media sites. So I think even on this part, I can also say that China is also deploying 50-cent army, right, quote unquote. So their job is to comment on social media sites, right, to turn reality into to distort reality. So I think that is more appropriate if I put in that way, right? So that is happening in our community. It is very clear.
So, Yeshila, this begets the obvious question. How does your diaspora, and in India, and I suspect this would happen beyond India as well, how do you resist these attempts at infiltration, subversion? I mean, we've also watched speeches of the Sikyong, Sri Lobsang Sangye talking about constant hacking attempts vis-a-vis the CTA's servers, etc. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, first I'll talk about hacking, right? That happens very oftenly in our community, especially Tibetan government in exile. There were many experts who believe that China is trying to hack our system, and that happened very often, right? Uh, when it comes to spying, right? You I think you must be aware about Lama Tseta, who was once a practitioner of Doji Shukden, right?
Correct.
But later, he exposed, how Chinese government is, deploying, spies in Tibetan community, how Chinese government is trying to, buy, Dergil, practitioners, right? So he exposed everything. I even interviewed him, and he knows that, how Chinese government is, executing their plans. He said there's an office in Nepal, right? Wherever China's, embassy, is present, right? So they're, executing through embassies, right? They're giving, a huge amount of money, right? So this is how Chinese government works, and our community in exile knows how Chinese government executes, and we have security, Department of Security, who is looking after these matters, right? So I think this is how our exile community resist China's spying mechanism.
Correct.
Professor Mueller, this, of course, is a very nice way to segue into the subversion of our own democracies because of Chinese presence. Now, the trouble is this: we allow the Chinese to use our websites like Twitter so that they can run disinformation campaigns. While there's no way to really go behind the digital, there's no real mass way of going behind the digital Great Wall that China has erected. Similarly, companies are more than willing to censor content on behalf of the Chinese. And some of our governments also seem to kowtow their lines because of the immense money China holds. All of this has been eroding our own democratic institutions domestically. It seems that wherever China goes, there's disinformation. What's the view from Europe regarding this?
Well, certainly China is one of the, I think, threats for, if you will, European democracy, alongside with Russia, perhaps, when it comes to disinformation and subversion, and perhaps instrumentalization of society here, of tenets, of stakeholders in our society, academia, the media, businesses, television, and so forth. They are really targets of this concerted approach. For example, if one looks at the use of Western newspapers, for example, to disseminate propaganda, there's as has been said, there are considerable financial resources in play. Media companies are in need of financing, so advertisement is quite, I think, something they are very susceptible of doing for the Chinese government. And so it so happens that, for example, German newspapers or European newspapers whose correspondents are being harassed or whose colleagues are being harassed in China by the Chinese government are taking money from Chinese government stakeholders to disseminate the propaganda and whitewashing that is entailed, and that's part of this, those advertisements, those inserts, and so forth. So it's a quite of an absurd situation. If I just take this one specific example, we can also speak about the Confucius Institutes here in the West, which are playing, which have come into focus here more recently, and are being looked at with more skepticism, which we, I think, welcome. But there are a number of false perceptions, and also if one looks at the corporate sector, there is also naivete and greed involved. For example, if German companies or communities are teaming up and establishing cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative and hail this as a accomplishment to improve their economic situation. And there are some harbors involved in Germany specifically. And if you go beyond Germany, one can look at Greece, can look at Hungary. Outside the European Union, there's Serbia, where there's a large investment and promise of investment and financial benefit involved for those governments and countries, which is being promised by the CCP. And I think a lot of corporate actors and stakeholders underestimate what this entails for them. If we look at the recent EU sanctions and counter sanctions and what ensued thereafter with regard to H&M, with regard to Adidas and some other companies who were singled out as targets for so-called popular anger in China, being taken off social media with their web shops, which has a tremendous financial impact, of course. So how can these companies believe there is a secure environment for investment, for doing business with China? So this is really the other side of the coin, which is being ignored here. But now it becomes more and more obvious, and I think it's perhaps helpful that it becomes more obvious for also corporate stakeholders to understand the implications of their engagement with the Chinese government and what that means also for their own corporate interests. And I think, as you say, this is a slow process of realization here in Europe. From my point of view, it's still too slow in realization. Things are going still in the wrong direction, and I think one could be hopeful for change, for new China policies, perhaps after our general elections here in Germany. Who knows? But it would certainly be a much longer way than in America.
So you mentioned things still going wrong. I think it would be very helpful to us and the viewers if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've mentioned the academia, the academic sector, the censorship that it's entailed to the Confucius Institutes, also to investment of publishing houses in China. But let's also look at the big telecommunication sector here in Europe, and you know that as one big issue is Huawei, that the Huawei Corporation being involved in the setup of the 5G systems here in Europe. And particularly Germany, as one of the larger European countries, has been very ambivalent about Huawei's engagement. The German government has not really taken a conclusive stand on the issue. One feels like they want to have the business opportunity, but at the same time protect our security. Both doesn't work at the same time with Huawei. And there's also the ethical component of Huawei being a state actor that is also involved in the crimes in Xinjiang and perhaps beyond in Tibet, which we don't know completely. So there is another aspect, and there's I think it's a controversy, but one would hope that the German government and political stakeholders here would have a more decisive position, and I think a more realistic position of what would a Huawei engagement mean for our security, not just in Germany, but also for other countries here.
Professor Muller, it's nothing new that China weaponizes all economic interactions. We, as one of China's larger trading partners, we bore the brunt of Chinese economic warfare time and again. Whenever there's a deterioration, there's automatically an economic repercussion. The same thing we saw during the coronavirus pandemic's lingering after effects as well. You alluded to the fact that how H&M and Adidas had their stores taken out of their maps, had their social media pulled down, and how that was a huge problem. Similarly, on the academic front, especially in the United States, there's cases time and again of very senior researchers not disclosing their ties to China and they're caught by intelligence agencies. Why is it happening? Why do you think that, say, for your country, Germany, they know all of these facts on the table, how dangerous it is to deal with China, yet why is there persistent ambivalence?
Well, that's a very good question, and I cannot really look into the heads of the stakeholders, unfortunately. But there seems to be a pattern here of compartmentalizing foreign policy vis-a-vis China. Germany or the EU tends to put all of those fields of relationship into separate boxes. For example, human rights into one box, economic relationship, trade in the next box, and perhaps we have a third box in terms of strategic security, strategic interests, and a fourth box maybe climate change. So Europe tends to believe it can handle all of these matters separately, as if they were not interconnected. So one day the EU has a human rights dialogue with China, and it's making statements at the UN Human Rights Council, for example. On the next day, we have a investment agreement that largely overlooks human rights aspects. Then we have climate change negotiations and dialogues with China from the EU side and Germany that overlooks the question of the rights of those affected on the ground, and that's very pertinent for Tibetans and Mongols, for example. So all of these things are being perceived as not being interconnected, while at the same time, the Chinese government is making these connections, and they are instrumentalizing, from my point of view, those issues for advancing in one field or the other. So there is perhaps the opposite view on those things. Clearly, that shows with the economic leverage that's being played out in the political field. So, for example, we have seen in the past that, for example, Greece has not agreed to have a critical statement at the UN on China, so the EU couldn't make this statement, and China effectively intervened into EU foreign policy making. So this is really problematic, and I think there is a perception of also quite comfortably so, perhaps, to look at trade only and then not tie it to human rights. There are, of course, stakeholders here in Germany, in Europe, who look at this quite critically, and that's maybe the silver lining here, that there are also those in parliaments and also in governments who have understood this interconnection. But I think corporate interest does play a tremendous role. Germany in particular has, with the large automotive sector, the chemical sector, the large corporations in particular, have made themselves dependent on the Chinese market, which is problematic, which is being viewed as problematic, and less so the medium-sized corporations who have applied a more critical view for quite some time now on the Chinese government policies and on the position of corporations and businesses in China from Germany and Europe. So there's also, we need to differentiate here, but it's mainly the large corporations that influence China policy, and alongside there is perhaps this compartmentalized view of China relations.
Ishanji,
Yes, sir.
I would like to comment three things on China's disinformation warfare.
Please.
Please.
First thing that I would like to raise is about China's, propaganda mechanism. Right. China's propaganda mechanism is a part of, what we call sharp power, a new concept in international relations, right? Which was coined by Christopher Walker, who defined that sharp power is basically about a propaganda to distort the reality. So that is happening around the world, right? When it comes to China. Second thing that I would like to comment on China's disinformation warfare is that we all know that all major social media sites are banned in China, right?
Right.
Be it Twitter, YouTube, Google, Facebook. But I don't know why Chinese officials are using Twitter, right? Recently, Chinese foreign spokesperson proudly tweeted that China is a democratic country where people are upholding the principles of democracy, right? So that is the second thing, right? The last thing is we all know that China is paying a huge amount of money to media, right, to highlight their story, their narrative, right? Look at what is happening in India. There are many top level media, newspapers, right, e-papers, right? They are publishing China's narrative stories when it comes to Tibet.
The journalists
now,
under investigation for that also.
Yes. Now when we try to rebut their comment, their narrative, right? But these newspaper media, right? These media, right? Don't accept our rebuttal piece, because they have already accepted money from Chinese government, right? So this is how Chinese government is trying to propagate their narrative, right, in order to overshadow the world's view of China.
It is interesting.
Yeshi, I actually wanted to ask you regarding, say, Kaiser's recent comment. So he was describing how there is growing consciousness in Europe regarding how human rights and how the economics of how it all works out, the security of all, they're not separable. Right? What China is doing in Tibet and Xinjiang and the way the Chinese government works will ultimately affect any democracy which wants to deal with China. Similarly, say in the United States, we know that President Biden has continued President Trump's sharp antagonism against China. And even the Tibet Act, which was part, the Support to Tibet Act, which was part, is very strong in its language and conviction. In this scenario where there's growing consciousness, how has your work changed? How has your work changed? How does it help, or does it make it more difficult because China represses Tibetans even more?
In exile, our aim is to represent Tibetans in Tibet, right? So they have huge hope, right, on us, they always believe that, we will do something. So under the leadership of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and Dr. Lobsang Sangye, right, we have been doing our best to get international community support. So with the recent USA new law, Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2020, so which is a huge message to Chinese government regarding
Yeah.
anything related to Tibet, right? One of the major point of this new law is regarding the reincarnation of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. So we all are concerned about his reincarnation because Chinese government says that they have the right to choose the next Dalai Lama, right? If international community goes after China, then they can appoint their own Dalai Lama. But that is not happening because USA rejected, their domination. They said that if China appoints, their own Dalai Lama, then they will sanction the concerned authorities in this part, right? So we are getting, boost when international community helps us, when they raise our issues, right? We become stronger. So our message to Chinese government is very clear that we will never ever give up, right? We will try our level best, right? Until unless we get freedom, back in Tibet.
So I think this would be a good point to have this discussion. You already talked about last time as well as now the American bill, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. Now, since December 2020, when it actually looked like the European Union and China were to have a deal, now let's fast forward to March 24th almost. You've had sanctions, counter-sanctions, as Professor Muller has talked about. Now, we've talked about these two things. Let's segue also to the British Parliament. We've also had sanctions and counter-sanctions against 9 parliamentarians, we're talking about Uyghurs as well as Tibetan issues. So it almost seems like at least the 3 nerve centers, as far as the Western world, seem to be having a similar experience when it comes to China regarding this. How has this affected your work in the Central Tibetan Administration? What is the view on the inside in the diaspora? And then, Professor Muller, we can come to you for the mechanics of what exactly happened with the sanctions and counter-sanctions.
When, as far as the sanctions against Chinese officials is concerned, I think it is a message to the whole world, right? I know, it won't, help, much because, China always believe that they're very strong and they don't listen to anybody, right? So that is very clear. But, it sends a huge message to the international community because if USA is, doing such work, the rest should, follow USA, right? If, the whole world, pressurize Chinese government, then they will realize, their mistake, right? But when it comes to, sanctioning, international community from China, that also wouldn't help, Chinese government because, recently when China sanctioned, 5, parliamentarians of UK, and they met, UK Prime Minister, and they released a statement, and they said that, these kind of, intimidation, right,
Yeah.
gives them, I should say, spirit to redouble their efforts to work on behalf of, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers, right? So this is a kind of, a sanction, diplomacy, right? It happens, right? But the important part is, from international community, if they sanction Chinese, officials, it is sending a huge message to the whole world, right? And it says that, it implies that the rest should follow whatever they are doing, because when we look at today's world, right, it is just say whatever they wish to say, rest has to follow, right? That is happening. If you look at South Asian countries, now they are becoming part of China because if one road, one belt initiative, right? Look at what is happening in Sri Lanka, right? Nepal, right? So if China, orders anything, it is up to the nation, right? Right? Whether to follow or not, right? If international community is not following, China, I think the whole, nation, the whole nation should understand why China matters to the world, why China is, dangerous to the world. I think that is what, it sums up.
Professor Mueller.
Yes, with regard to the EU sanctions and counter sanctions, I think it's quite remarkable that the EU has sanctioned individuals who were basically who carry responsibility, but there is one person missing. We were expecting to be on the list, and that's the current party secretary Chen Guangguo, who is, as we already mentioned, has been a party secretary in Tibet Autonomous Region before. So he is being viewed as the mastermind of these policies applied in Xinjiang by many. So it's quite notable that he's not on the list, and maybe one explanation for that is that he is also a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party. So he's a national politician, if you will, apart from those other three individuals who hold positions in the public security sector, and this one construction company also on a regional level. So it's quite notable and rather obvious that the EU did try to measure the sanctions, even when they were applying those sanctions, which are the first sanctions after Tiananmen Square, laid on China. And then if you look at the counter reaction by the Chinese government, you'll find parliamentarians, you find think tanks, you find individuals on this list who basically are not who do not resemble the position being held by those on the Chinese side. So there's no parliamentarian being sanctioned by the EU, and there's no think tank being sanctioned by the EU. So this can be, I think, quite obviously being viewed as a disproportionate reaction, and quite a harsh reaction that will be a heavy burden on the further negotiations and the ratification process of the investment agreement. My view on this is that the investment agreement will not be ratified under these circumstances by the European Parliament, and this is a widely held view here in Europe, and quite a blow for those long negotiations that have had been undertaken for some 7 years or so, until last December when they were concluded. So this is really a quite notable development, and some would even speculate that the Chinese government, with their harsh reaction, calculated that the ratification will not take place, thereby sacrificing even the investment agreement. And one could speculate further, but that's a different discussion. I think what is most important here in Europe is that Europe has shown, I think, to the Communist Party that there's a tangible reaction, and it's quite something different to the language and the image that the EU offered when concluding the investment agreement, which was seen as quite tasteless in terms of raising forced labor in Xinjiang and human rights violations altogether. So quite a departure, quite a new development. And this, of course, changes a little bit the landscape also for those who advocate for human rights also in Tibet, who advocate for a just solution of the Tibet conflict based on dialogue, hopefully. And it can open new doors, but it is a very complex situation, because the next couple of months will show into what direction the policy makers will go here in Europe, and perhaps so also in China.
Professor Mueller, many people across the world viewed this agreement as a German project. And the timing indeed was rather strange. The world is still reeling from the coronavirus pandemic, which most people blame on China. Similarly, Chinese belligerence on its borders and even say within our democracies had been increasing. Why did the European Commission take such a big risk when it comes to the timing of such an agreement? Let alone the fact that we know that China weaponizes all economic interdependence. What was the motivation behind the policy making here?
Well, here I can only also make an assumption, speculate more or less. It is true that the conclusion of this agreement fell into the last hours, if you will, of the German EU presidency in December. Quite a surprise. So usually we human rights advocates are used to the Chinese government making such surprise moves in in between Christmas and New Year's Eve, hoping that this would not create much public attention. For example, if somebody is detained and so forth. Here we found out that, or it became clear that the European Union was using this sort of timing, which was surprising. But the motivation, certainly, perhaps, as some speculate, was that the German EU presidency simply wanted to get it done in their time of being at the helm of the European Union for those 6 months, and it certainly was a considerable surprise here in Europe to see this being concluded at this time. Also, immediately before, or almost immediately before, President Biden would take office in the US. So thereby introducing perhaps a new foreign policy, a new relationship with the European partners after the Trump presidency. So this was quite, again, quite notable. And it drew a lot of criticism, indeed, not just by human rights advocates like our organization and like from Tibetans and Uyghurs and others, but also from for example, government politicians here in Germany who criticized the really weak language in terms of forced labor in the commitment included in the investment agreement. So it drew a lot of criticism, and it will continue to be a hot item here in Europe and Germany, along with many others. I mentioned Huawei before. I mentioned trade relations altogether, Germany's and Europe's position in Asia, and so forth. And we'll see what will happen. I personally do not think that it will be ratified.
Deekhit, you have an opinion on Chinese diplomatic pushback. I think we would all be very obliged if you were to share that, and if Professor Muller and Yeshi could perhaps react to it.
You've been with me long enough to read my mind. My question exactly was about Chinese diplomatic. So, China's wolf warrior diplomacy, as they like to call it. My personal opinion, as of now, is it is as much a domestic stunt as it is international. The trouble is that Xi Jinping has been trying to shift the basis of Chinese legitimacy from economic growth, which was established by Deng Xiaoping, to classical 19th century European-style nationalism. The problem with that proposition is that while, of course, if this is successful, it can successfully protect the CCP's rule even as economic growth slows down inevitably. But simultaneously, it will need the invention of enemies and a siege mentality. China needs to portray to its own people that the world is actively conspiring against China, trying to pull it down. And China is always in the right. It's always been the Middle Kingdom. So I personally believe that wolf warrior diplomacy is a symptom rather than really the disease of the mentality which has infested the Xi Jinping administration. It's about the centrality of China, and it's about how they're trying to change the basis of the very legitimacy of the Chinese state. Now, in this process, I expect chaos, but aren't we all paying for all that chaos? It'll be great if we could get both of your comments on that. Let's start with Reshila.
Okay, when it comes to China's warrior diplomacy, right? I think it is my personal belief that whatever Xi Jinping is trying to do is to portray his ability to run China, right? As we all know that now he's a lifelong president of China, right? So now he has that power, but now he needs people's allegiance, and he must have legitimacy over China's rule. So in that part, I think he has did his best. Like I'll give an example. I think Chinese government has published, I think, 3 or 4 books of Xi Jinping's thought. Right.
Yes.
Now he's trying to instill these ideas into Chinese citizens, not only in Chinese citizens, but if you look at Tibetans, Uyghurs, right, they are being cynicized with re-education camps, right. I think as far as Xinjiang is concerned, there are more than 385 re-education camps in Xinjiang. As far as Australian institutes, I think one think tank based in Australia's report is concerned, right.
Yeah.
So that's why China, he's trying to instill his ideas into Chinese citizens, so that he will have more loyalty from Chinese citizens, right. That makes him more powerful, right. If he gets loyalty from his people, then he thinks that he can now move on to conquer the world. I think this is how Xi Jinping's warrior diplomacy works.
Professor Muller, are institutions of global governance also being cynicized through Xi Jinping thought? Now, you work in human rights advocacy, and we know that consistently on the United Nations fora, China has tried to change meanings of established words in order to bring cultural relativism to the fore. China has been actively trying to make partners in this endeavor of its own to change what human rights means by bringing on board certain, say, Latin American, African, and Asian nations which have similar interests. So, is Xi Jinping thought really limited to China, or are we seeing an implicit assault on our global governance?
I think the concern is legitimate. I'd say to be critical to the concern regarding the ever more present thinking and ideology on the international stage that is being pushed by the Chinese government. We see it on a constant level at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in Geneva, where a certain language is being introduced that is to substitute or replace existing human rights standards and discourse, subtly so, to instill a certain perception of what the meaning of human rights and their function are vis-a-vis governments, between the individual and the state, and so forth. This is quite obvious. It is very obvious, and it's quite concerning that more countries from the global south are becoming part of this camp, if you will. In Geneva, we've been noting some 80 or so states at the Human Rights Council supporting moves by the Chinese government. There is a majority voting for a Chinese resolution at the Human Rights Council itself. The membership is a little bit restricted, so it's talk about 40 plus members, but yet there's a majority voting for China, which does not have such a legal binding effect yet, because there are enough countries who oppose and vote against such resolutions. So China is not there yet. I am somewhat intrigued by the lending and the credit policy vis-a-vis countries of the global south. And there's an increasing realism also on the negative effects on what this money, this crediting, this lending means for those countries. And quite obviously, it's being used for political leverage. I think that is something to be hugely concerned of, and countries, states, stakeholders need to be aware what they are talking about when they are talking with or to the Chinese government. And this is particularly relevant with regard to human rights, because this is an area where we can see so many attempts to reshape, redefine, reorganize structures, language, discourses by the Chinese government. So they need to be on alert.
I would like to quickly respond to Professor Kai Muller's comments on China's redefinition of human rights.
Please.
As far as China's human rights, definition is concerned, it is believed that food and shelter is the definition of their human rights. So they believe that if you have food and shelter, that is more than enough, and they don't care about basic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement. They don't care about all these basic rights. All they care about is food and shelter, and that is also part of their the so-called poverty alleviation propaganda or mechanism, I should say, because they are trying to impress the world with their poverty alleviation mechanism. That, to my mind, is to overshadow the reality happening in China, right? In regard to Xinjiang, right, and Tibetans. So China's definition of human rights is totally unacceptable. Since China is a member of Human Rights Council, right? So they can do anything, right? Whatever they wish, they can pass any resolution. So the world must be aware of this thing.
Yeshila, Professor Mueller, there's some very interesting developments happening these days, particularly when it comes to the Quad. So people traditionally think that the Quad grouping really is limited to just the security aspect, which is the traditional security aspect. However, when I was going through, say, the recent Quad meets, notes, whatever had happened, speeches, and so on, there seems to be a consonance on two very important factors which can define the century which remains for us. One of them is technology. There seems to be a Quad 5G group informally being built up along with the UK, whereby core technologies which will define the future of how our societies and economies work, we're trying to find alternatives against China for it. Similarly, human rights. Again, there seems to be a huge consonance suddenly on human rights, including a country like India, which has traditionally been very reserved about it because of its positions and realities. Do you think that the world indeed is coming together now, not explicitly against China necessarily, but to restate its own values and its own future? Yeshi sir.
Definitely, if you look at what happened recently regarding Beijing Winter Olympic 2022, and USA has categorically stated that they will think about their participation in the Winter Olympic 2022, right? They will discuss with their allies, right? So if they are coming together, right. So as you mentioned at the Quad, right? Even our Dr. Lobsang Sangye, who also emphasized on this great opportunity, because it is a new opportunity for Tibetans, right? If we focus more on Quad, right? If they can highlight the issue of Tibet, if they come together on our issue, then they can pressurize Chinese government, like what they did regarding Beijing Olympic 2022, right? So they have already sent a huge message to Chinese government and Chinese governments also retorted, right, regarding their message. So I think this will help us, help us in a long way, right? If we, if we garner, these kind of opportunity, if we could raise, if we could highlight what is happening in Tibet, and if we can get, attention from these, Quad members, I think it will help us a lot.
Professor Meena, do you think the world is coming together?
Well, I'm not sure. I can't say. I would be hopeful, but I think it would not, in any case, would not work without such countries such as India, for example. And I think it would be very helpful if India could consider playing a more active role on the multilateral level, for example, at the United Nations, wherever it finds suitable. There have been examples where India has joined other countries, for example, in terms of resolutions at the Human Rights Council, as I mentioned. So this is a positive development, and the Indian government has also taken a position there more, I think, assertively. But I think much more can be done, and not just in those, on the abstract policy level, but also with regard to Tibet. I would see a lot of opportunities, particularly with regard to religious freedom. India's voice would be very, very helpful also to convince and to draw in more support from the West, because one cannot take support from Europe as a given. There needs to be constant reminder of actually what is going on in Tibet, and also what is going on in Tibet, or what is the view from an immediate neighbor of China and Tibet, such as India. So the role of democratic Asian countries must not be underestimated. I would hope that India would play a more prominent role.
So Yeshila, on that note, what deliverables do you think you'd like to see from the Indian government in this direction?
First thing that I would like to see is to raise concerns about His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's reincarnation. Even if Indian government says that China doesn't have any ounce of right when it comes to His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's reincarnation, I think that will send a huge message to the rest of the world, right? Because His Holiness is in India. And the second thing that I would like to hear from Indian government is now His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is aging, right? Now he's about to be 86 in July. So they have to accept central Tibetan administration, right? So far, they haven't accepted our community as central Tibetan administration, right? So I think if they accept if they accept like USA government did, right, in USA policy of Tibetan policy and support of 2020, right, we will get more recognition around the world. So that I think Indian government can do. But if we look at the border tension, right, I think it is not very easy for the government of India, right, when it comes to Tibet, because they have to deal with the Chinese government, right, on the other side, right. But Indian government can do some things for Tibet. Like first thing that I would like to raise is conferring Bharat Ratna, right. We are not demanding it, but it is high time, right, for the government of India, right, because His Holiness always says that he is a son of India, right, and his body is made up of dal and lentils and rice, right, and he is the longest guest in India, and he is spreading India's traditional values around the world. And I'll tell you one very important thing: when he met Obama, right, he was talking more about India's traditions, India's civilizational values, then Tibetan course. Imagine now he's an ambassador of India's civilizational values to the world, right? So when we from political angle, I think conferring of Bharatna is not suitable at this moment. But Indian government has to find a suitable environment, right, to do so, right. So that will also send a huge message to the Chinese government. So that thing I think India can do it. And the third thing that I would like to raise is when it comes to Tibetan issue, I think after 2014, uh, the central government is very shy away from Tibetan issue, and they are not I think the current prime minister haven't spoken a word about Tibet so far, if I'm not mistaken, right? So now they have to come forward, right, and they have to find the right time to speak about Tibet. That will also confront China, right? So India should not follow appeasement policy all the time, because it is not what Chinese government needs, right? They always the Chinese government needs respect, and if Indian government gives respect to China, then China won't reciprocate. They think it is a it is a it is a source of domination for them, right? So I think
Yes.
these are the things that I would like to hear from Indian government.
That's understandable. Deekhit, you had some questions about the diaspora still.
I did. I did. So Yeshila has given us a great insight into the workings of the Indian diaspora here. However, as we know, say the present Sikyong, Shri Lobsang Sangye, he's an American citizen. Similarly, in the Tibetan Parliament, we have seats reserved for Tibetans across the world, Europe included. Now, you've given us a good overview of how the Indian diaspora, which is by far the largest, works. But I'm sure Professor Mueller works with the Tibetan diaspora, or at least knows about them at a very intimate level out there in Europe. How do they function? What do they do? And how are you involved with them?
Sorry, I didn't get the whole question.
My question was for Professor Mueller
Okay.
as to how exactly does the Tibetan diaspora in Europe work with him, and what does his work entail?
Well, I mean, there are indeed a number of Tibetans living here in Germany or in Europe for quite some decades. Not as many as in India, of course, or in the United States, but there's a considerable group of Tibetans, most of them living in Switzerland and recently in Belgium to a larger number. The Tibetans in Europe are traditionally very, very active politically. So there are a number of Tibet associations that organize political action and also cultural events, and also, for example, language classes in order to protect Tibetan culture and identity. So that is very, very, I think, notable, very, very impressive also to see how much energy and effort is being put into such programs and activities. On the other hand, of course, Tibetans in Europe are being exposed to the European culture, and also there's a need to somewhat integrate into the host countries' cultures. I'd say the Tibetans have become normal citizens and are no longer refugees and strangers any longer in those countries, if they've stayed there for a longer time, if they've been born there, and so forth. So this is, of course, the ambivalence of Tibetan existence, if you will, in Europe or in foreign countries. There is a strong I think, interest and a lot of energy being put into preserving the culture. But then again, Tibetans have, as far as we can see, integrated quite well. In Switzerland, for example, many taking a lot of careers in very different fields, which is quite impressive. So the integration is taking its toll on the Tibetan culture. But I think what is most important is also the political activity here, and the continuing interest in the community in what is going on in their home country, what is going on also in India with the exile community there. The elections are now another huge point of interest here in Europe. Lots of discussions going on social media, and an election being organized under quite difficult circumstances, not under the COVID pandemic, but also with limited resources, with faraway voting places, and actually not a structure that is backed up by a full-fledged administration in every single country. So that is quite remarkable. There is, of course, I mean, they're ambivalent. There's an ambivalence, of course, but by and large, I'd say the Tibetans living in Europe are very important to also communicate authentically the Tibetan aspirations here vis-a-vis the governments and the parliaments. That's why the Tibetan community associations are so important. That's also why it's so important to have a representation of the Tibetan government in exile in various capitals and in Geneva here in Europe. And this is really something very important also for us as a civil society organization, the connection to the Tibetans and also to the if you will, the administration of the Tibetans in exile. And there is, of course, exchange of ideas. There is, of course, cooperation, and I think that has been a factor for success in the past, or for effective advocacy in the past, because I think Tibetans have still a great or a considerable backing among parliamentarians and governments here. It could be more, but it could be also much less.
And what about you, Yeshila? As far as connectivity between the diaspora abroad and your diaspora in India, clearly there is some connectivity. As Deekhit mentioned, the current Sikyong is an American national. The election for that office, in some ways, a global campaign, almost a global affair. I think it would be particularly fascinating for all of us. I'm sure Professor Muller is more than aware. If you could tell us about the two candidates and what exactly are the issues that are sort of the cornerstones of this election.
Okay, I think I should abstain or should I say refrain from I can't talk on these candidates, but as far as their political manifesto are concerned, I think both will work for the cause of Tibet, right? And whoever wins, I think will have to work harder, because the incumbent, Sikyong, right, has done huge, work for the cause of Tibet, right, from U.S. Tibetan policy and support act of 2020, and in terms of infrastructural development in central Tibetan administration, and his connectivity around the world, and his appearances on international fora and international communities talk or anything, right? So I think he has a big shoe to fill, right? Whosoever wins will have to fill that shoe, right? So but I'll now comment on connectivity, right, in diaspora. As Professor Kai Muller has said that Tibetans in German and abroad are working very actively, right, for the cause of Tibet, and it is very true because in India, Tibetans are also working very hard, and with the help of Indian Tibet support groups, right, they're also they're also helping us to disseminate the fundamental idea of Tibet to the local Indians, right? And recently, I think 2 days back, I think a regional convener of co-group for Tibetan cause, right? His name is Phunzok Ladaki. He formed a Tibetan support group in Jammu and Kashmir. Imagine. So he said that the idea was to disseminate or to work grassroots level for the cause of Tibet, right? So that is happening in India. Now, if we talk about abroad, right, we have so many Tibet support groups like Professor
Yeah.
Kai Muller, right? So they have been helping us a lot in different ways in terms of education, in terms of finance, right, in terms of highlighting the international Tibet issue at international fora. And when we have a support like this, that automatically gives us boost, right? And it if I put it in a simple way, it says like it goes like if they are working so hard on our behalf, then why should not we, right? So I think in terms of connectivity, right, we are doing very well. And so Chinese government believes that after the Dalai Lama, Tibet's course won't last, but that will not happen, right? We are still here, and we will carry forward the legacy of Dalai Lama and our course.
Deekhit, unless you have any further questions, I think we can give them the floor for a few minutes each. Do you have any more questions, Deekhit?
My inquisitive is boundless, my friend, but our time is.
Excellent. So,
I think we should give Professor Muller now the floor. A couple of minutes. Any message you would like to put out? Any thoughts on your mind? Any message for Tibetans, Chinese, the Indians, your own countrymen, whatever it may be.
anything you'd like to end this with?
Well, thank you very much for having me today here. I think Tibet is not just a matter for Tibetans. I'd say it has been mentioned here in this very interesting discussion today already. What the Chinese government is doing in Tibet is it may resort to do in other aspects, in other policy areas. The instruments being used and tested in Tibet and in Xinjiang, the recklessness, the disregard for international law and principles, it may also be applied in other areas of policy far away from Tibet and Xinjiang. This should be on the minds of everybody who's dealing with this Communist Party. And I would like to stress that we should not fall for a narrative that is being pushed by the Chinese government, by the Communist Party, that China equals the Communist Party. This is something I would oppose quite vehemently because it artificially implies that this CCP is speaking for a population of more than 1 billion people without any free, fair elections, without any process of somewhat voluntary decision making and voluntary choosing of leadership. So this should be really should be made clear, and we try to emphasize this. China is not the CCP. Yet, I think what we need to also be mindful of is that the Chinese government is, the CCP is, what also has been mentioned before, is creating enemies. It's creating an external enemy in Tibet by vilifying, by ostracizing the Dalai Lama, speaking of a so-called Dalai clique, speaking of separatism, that is the mother, to be the mother, allegedly, of all issues and problems in Tibet. This is not the case. And one should be aware that this is something that resembles elements of totalitarian rule, where legitimizing of policies is connected to creating this external threat, this enemy, which is artificially created. So we need to be I think, aware of this ingrain of this structural disposition of the CCP leadership, which thinks in terms of enemies. And one very interesting footnote here from my end, when I studied back in 2008, 2009, reports by Chinese think tanks, which then were still able to operate. There was one particular one in Beijing, very interesting one, was shut down after that. They did some field research in Tibetan areas after the countrywide protests from 2008, and they found out that most of the local CCP cadres had used the accusation of separatism, of splitting the country, to really deflect their incompetence, because things were going wrong because they were corrupt and they were incompetent. And it was easy for them to blame outside forces like the Dalai Lama or separatists and foreign forces like the West for their failures. And I think this is really dangerous, because it creates really an artificial universe of policies where reality, where artificial, created reality overlays actually decision making and policy making. And it would be my wish if we all could understand more deeply that more time would be spent also by international policymakers, stakeholders, legislators, to actually understand the effects of these mechanisms, this thinking of this ideology, this sort of power model of power exerted by the CCP. I think a lot would become more clear. I think there would be a lot more understanding for why Tibetans are still resilient after 60 years, because I think they understand very well the effects of these kind of twisted and actually failed policies.
Yeshi, how about yourself? Including statement.
Okay, so before I comment, I would like to thank Ishan and Deekhit, right, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. So I just want to raise 3 points why the world should, care about Tibet. The first thing is about, Tibet's, river, right? Tibet has the 10 largest rivers in the world, right? That comes from Tibet and goes into Bangladesh and into Assam and Pakistan. So that gives a lifeline to almost 1.3 something people who are dependent on Tibet's rivers, right? So if they care about Tibet, I think they will have free water very soon, because right now Chinese government is trying to dam all these major rivers, and they did one on Brahmaputra. So that is a huge threat to the Indian downstream countries, right? That's why they should care about Tibet. Number one. Number two is as we all know, Tibet is Tibet has abundant natural resources, which Chinese government is exploiting. Why Chinese government has huge amount of money? Because of Tibet's natural resources. Why China's mobile phones are cheap? Because of Tibet's natural resources like lithium, right? So I think 80% of lithium comes from Tibet. If Chinese government is extracting all these lithiums from Tibet and they make batteries, that's why Chinese mobiles are very cheap. So that's why if the world needs Tibet's natural resources, now it is high time to care about Tibet's situation, right? And the last thing that I would like to raise here is Tibet's course is like a litmus test uh, between apart from barrel of a gun and apart from Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha, right? If you believe in truth, right? Because Tibet's course is based on truth, right? We have our narrative, and China occupied us illegally, right? If we believe in truth, if we believe in what we call in India Satyameva Jayate, right? Truth alone, triumphs,
Right.
right? So now it is litmus test between truth, right? Truth, Tibet's narrative and in China's narrative, right? So whosoever triumphs, right, will have huge repercussions, because if China triumphs, right, then China will follow the blueprints used in Tibet to the rest of the world, right? If we triumph, right, I think the peace will prevail. So I think with these 3 points, I would like to uh, thank the organizer for giving me this wonderful opportunity, and it is really nice to see Professor Kai Muller again. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So that was a very pertinent note. I'd like to thank Yeshi and Professor Muller. Thank you for being very insightful and candid as always, and we look forward to having more discussions like this and working together in the future. Thank you very, very much for your time, and we'll be in
Thank
touch
you.
regarding the
Thank you.
videos and everything. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.